On the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941, the German army crossed into the Soviet Union in the largest invasion ever launched. The newsreels showed tank columns and dive bombers, and that footage has defined the image of the German army ever since. A modern force, engines, armor, speed. Behind those tanks that morning walked more than 600,000 horses. Across the whole of the Second World War, the German armed forces used somewhere in the region of 2.75 million horses. That is not a rounding error in the story of a mechanized army. That is the army. And what happened to those animals explains more about why the war in the East went the way it did than almost anything you will see in a documentary. Start with what a German infantry division actually was. A standard German infantry division in 1941 had a paper strength of around 17,000 men and roughly 5,000 horses. The horses pulled the artillery, the ammunition wagons, the field kitchens, the medical carts, and the supply train. The men walked. A division like this moved at the pace of a horse pulling a loaded wagon over a bad road, which is to say something around 20 to 30 kilometers on a good day and considerably less on a wet one. The famous armored and motorized divisions were the exception, not the rule. Of the more than 150 divisions committed to the invasion of the Soviet Union, only around a fifth had engines throughout. The rest were built exactly as the German army of 1914 had been built, with the difference that the artillery was heavier and the distances were far greater. This was not a secret inside the German general staff. It was a known and permanent weakness. Germany did not have the oil, the rubber, the vehicle production capacity, or the spare parts industry to motorize an army of that size, and it never came close. Where the propaganda said engines, the reality said oats, and oats were the problem. A working draft horse needs roughly 10 kilograms of feed a day to keep doing heavy work. Multiply that across 600,000 animals, and you have thousands of tons of fodder required daily, moving forward along the same single-track railways and the same collapsing roads that were supposed to be carrying fuel, ammunition, and food for the men. In the German supply system, horse feed regularly took up more rail tonnage than any other single category of cargo. The planners had an answer for this, and the answer was that the horses would live off the land. In France in 1940, that worked. France had rich agriculture, dense road networks, and short distances. In the Soviet Union, it did not work at all. The German army's horses were mostly heavy Western European breeds, the sort bred for good pasture and good stabling. They needed grain. The regions the army moved through had already been stripped, first by the retreating Soviets and then by the advancing Germans. And by autumn, the units were feeding their animals on straw pulled off the roofs of village houses. Then came the mud. Twice a year, in autumn and again in spring, the roads of Western Russia and Ukraine turned to deep liquid mud. Wheeled vehicles sank to the axles. Horses pulling artillery pieces sank to the belly. The photographs from October 1941 show teams of 10 and 12 animals harnessed to a single field gun, with soldiers pushing at the wheels, and both the men and the animals visibly finished. Then came the winter, and the winter killed them in numbers that are genuinely hard to take in. German horses had no winter coats because they had been kept in stables. There were no stables. Temperatures dropped far below anything the veterinary service had planned for. The animals were already starving from the autumn, and they were being worked to exhaustion on rations a third of what they needed. They died in harness on the roads, and the columns went round them and kept going. Estimates for the first winter in the East alone run into the hundreds of thousands of animals lost. What replaced them tells you everything about how the campaign had changed. The Germans began requisitioning the local horses. These were small, rough, unimpressive animals that Western officers had initially dismissed. They were also perfectly adapted, able to work on straw and forage, and to survive outside in weather that killed a Belgian draft horse in weeks. By the middle of the war, German supply columns in the east were increasingly pulled by requisitioned Russian and Polish farm horses, which is a fairly complete summary of what had happened to the great mechanized army of 1940. By 1944, the army needed hundreds of thousands of horses a year simply to replace losses, and Germany was combing occupied Europe for animals the way it was combing it for labor. Estimates for the total number of horses that died in German service across the war run from around 1 million to close to 2 million, depending on which categories are counted. Almost none of them are memorialized anywhere. Because the animals mattered so much, the German army maintained an entire apparatus to keep them alive, and its size is the clearest evidence of how central they were. There was a veterinary corps with thousands of qualified veterinarians, its own officer training, its own supply chain of medicines and shoes and harness, and a network of horse hospitals stretching back from the front. Sick and wounded animals were evacuated rearward in much the same way wounded men were, treated and returned to duty. Farriers were skilled tradesmen in short supply and were fought over between units. The army published manuals on feeding, on hoof care, on how to work a horse in extreme cold, and by 1942 those manuals were being rewritten because the pre-war assumptions had proved so badly wrong. Where the replacements came from is its own story. As German horses died, the army requisitioned across the whole of occupied Europe. Farms in Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia and Ukraine lost their working animals to German requisition parties, which for a small farm in 1942 meant the loss of the only means of ploughing, carting and harvesting. The removal of draft animals from occupied agriculture contributed directly to food shortages in those territories, which is a form of damage that rarely appears in accounts of the occupation because it is not dramatic and nobody filmed it. By the end, the traffic reversed. Surviving German horses were taken by the Allies as reparations, absorbed into Soviet collective farms, or simply eaten, because Europe in the hunger winters of 1945 and 46 was not in a position to be sentimental about several 100,000 tons of meat on legs. Two stories from the very end of the war are worth telling, because they are the only part of this that anyone remembers. The first happened in the last week of April 1945 on the border between Bavaria and Czechoslovakia. American cavalry troops learned that a German army stud farm just across the frontier was holding several hundred valuable horses, including the breeding stock of the Lipizzaner line, along with a number of Allied prisoners of war. The Red Army was closing in from the east, and a starving front line has historically had one use for a horse. German officers at the farm, including a veterinarian, arranged to hand the place over. American units crossed into what was to become the Soviet occupation zone, took the surrender of the farm, and drove several hundred horses west on foot into American-held territory over a period of days, escorted by American troops and by the German soldiers who had been guarding them, with both sides now working the same operation. Around the same time, the head of the riding school that owned the performing stallions put on a display for an American general in Austria and formally asked for the animals to be placed under protection. The breed survived. The second story has no rescue in it. East Prussia had been the center of German horse breeding for 2 centuries. When the front reached it in the autumn of 1944, the civilian population fled west in the middle of winter, and the horse breeders went with them, driving their herds across the frozen coastal lagoon while under air attack. Ice broke under wagons. Animals went into the water. The trek continued for months, across hundreds of kilometers. Of the tens of thousands of registered breeding horses that had been in East Prussia before the war, something in the region of 1,000 reached the west. The entire modern population of that breed descends from that remnant. It is worth saying that the Germans were not alone in this, because the comparison is what makes the point land. The Red Army also fought the war on horses and used them in comparable numbers. The difference was that the Soviet Union was fighting on its own ground, with animals bred for that climate, on supply lines that shortened as the war went on, rather than lengthening. The horses were adapted to the conditions and the fodder was local. The country that genuinely did mechanize was the United States, and it did so because it had the oil, the factories and the shipping to move the result across an ocean. American infantry divisions were built around trucks from the outset. That contrast is the whole industrial argument of the war in one image. On one side of the front, columns of trucks. On the other, a Belgian draft horse in Russian mud in December, dying in harness for want of oats that the railway could not spare. The overall picture is stark. The German army fought the largest campaign in military history at the speed of a walking animal, on a logistics system that was consuming a substantial share of its own transport capacity, just to feed the animals doing the pulling. When the horses died, The guns and the supplies stopped, and infantry divisions that had lost their transport could not retreat any faster than they had advanced. 2.75 million horses served. Somewhere between 1 million and 2 million of them died. They were shot, bombed, starved, frozen, worked to death and eaten, and they do not appear in the casualty figures of any nation, because no nation counts them. The most modern army in Europe in 1940 was, from the first day of the war to the last, an army that ran on horses. It just never advertised the fact. Thanks for watching. If you want to know what happened to the men who commanded those divisions after the war, watch that story next. And if you want more forgotten aftermath stories from the Second World War, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.